It did work before. Oh, thank you. It doesn't work, thankfully. No, that's fine. Hi, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Camila Layortolan. For those of you who don't know me, I teach global studies, and all of my students are here, and everyone else. Thank you for coming. Dario Fabbri is joining us tonight. He's a journalist. He's a geopolitical expert. As those of you who take global studies with me know that politics, art, geography, and history and everything that comes intertwined together like a fantastic puzzle. So I'm going to leave the floor to him, and he's going to talk about international politics and geopolitics, and then we will open up the floor for questions and discussions.
Hello. Well, only this one. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for inviting me. This is my second time here at the University of Arkansas. As I know, as a matter of fact, I just asked about this. You guys weren't here last time that I was, likely for you. So there aren't things that you're going to hear again. Hopefully, there will be things that you never heard before. Who knows? You'll tell me after this. I spent several years going back and forth between Italy and Texas, so please bear with my accent today. What am I going to talk about today? Of course, this is not a geopolitical course. It couldn't be. It'll take definitely longer than 1 hour to delve ourselves into geopolitics, but we'll try to understand, and then we'll leave the floor to the debate with you. How far the competition between the US and China has gone, and what kind of competition that is, and also how Russia gets between the two main rivals for the, let's call it the global supremacy. But first and foremost, let me spend a couple of minutes, I promise it won't take long, to introduce geopolitics to you, because I think it's definitely legit that many of you never, of course you heard of it because it's trendy. It seems like life cannot be run without geopolitics nowadays. As a matter of fact, I was just invited a couple of weeks ago here in Italy to talk about the geopolitics of truffles, and still having a bit of self-esteem, I said no thanks. But that tells a lot about how trendy geopolitics has become in the past, 2 years, maybe 3 years. But what the hell is geopolitics? Here it gets complicated, but we'll try to make it simple. If we were to keep ourselves with the official definition, geopolitics was conceived at the end of the 19th century, and it was conceived by high school teachers in Germany and Sweden. So bear with them. We're talking about Swedes and Germans, not the coolest of people. Very solid, very serious, very honest, but cool is not their thing. But what did they conceive? They took geography, as your professor just said before me. They blended with politics, and they figured that they had invented a new discipline. And of course, ancient Greek comes in handy, and we have geopolitics. But is that really new? Is that something that they had devised and invented? Probably not. If we were to say geopolitics has been around since the beginning of the earth, since the beginning of, at least, of humans being on the earth, because geopolitics is nothing more than concentrating ourselves on nations, peoples interacting among them in a specific territory. Unfortunately, when people tend to interact, they do so in a bad way. They tend to wage wars. They tend to compete among themselves. It's not always, unfortunately, a peaceful competition. It's not always peaceful rivalries, as we all know. You've been around this earth long enough to know that wars are, let's say, an everyday fact. And I think, but I could be a pessimist, that we will deal with wars for the rest of our days and for the rest of the days that humans will live on this earth. So if we were to take geopolitics this way, it cannot be invented. And even more importantly, it could not be invented at the end of the 19th century. It's definitely too young to be about all that stuff. And if you were to study, for example, ancient Greek authors or Latin authors or even Persian authors, we were to find out that they were accustomed to geopolitics and that they were very used to write about geopolitics all the time. Julius Caesar, for example, when he wrote about the war in Gallia, he wrote about geopolitics. The first part of his study was about the German tribes, the Celtic and German tribes that he had found on the territory. It's an ethnographical study for the most part. And that, of course, gives us another piece of insight. Geopolitics, at least the way that I deal with geopolitics, is not only politics and geography, something more. You need to spruce it with some human touch, we were to say if we were poets. What do I mean? We have to remember that nations, empires, tribes, even criminal organizations, they're all made up of only humans. There's nothing more into them than humans. Nations are made up only of humans. But usually, sometimes because we don't know, sometimes because we think we're canny, we tend to pretend from nations something that we could not possibly pretend from ourselves. We want nations, states to be perfect. We want them to be rich, debtless, cultured, just. We want them to be peaceful, and so forth. And we want them to abide by the highest standards of morality. Something that, and I hope so, otherwise it would mean that your guys are all dead, something that we cannot possibly pretend from ourselves every day of our lives. I hope there are things, even in your young lives, that you're not that proud of. Of course, there are different degrees of negativity and criminal deeds. But we all have things that we're not proud of, that we did, that we thought, and so forth. And that is just the same for nations. When the war in Ukraine broke out, one of the most recurring questions that I was asked by students, but even by adults, of course, you're adults. They're adults. I'm sorry about that. Even by older people was, how come we're still waging wars in 2022, now in 2023? How's that possible? The answer to this, even if it sounds naive or childish, resides in you, me, get into a fight for a soccer game or for a football game, for a basketball game, whatever you like. Or maybe more importantly, for different factions inside of a office vying for leadership, creating alliances, finding enemies inside an office, inside a newsroom, inside of a school, inside of a class. We all know that. That's the main reason why we have wars, because that's inside the human nature, unfortunately. So, and I'll stop here, I promise, with the definition of geopolitics. What I deal with is the human geopolitics, so-called. Sometimes the geopolitics coming from the end of the 19th century tended to be deterministic, meaning let me see what kind of rivers your territory has, what kind of mountains your territory supports, and I'll tell you how it will end for you, what kind of wars you will fight, what kind of wealth you will have. That's not true. Geography is not destiny for sure. Sometimes, of course, geography gets into play, but it's not a destiny. How's that? Let's take the war in Ukraine, and then we'll move on to the competition between the US and China. If we were to ask ourselves, why are we witnessing to the war in Ukraine? What has triggered the war in Ukraine? Of course, we can contemplate many reasons, many answers, but it all gets down to human nature in the end. How so? The war, as we all know, was started by the Russians. They have invaded Ukraine, even if they do not call this a war, they call it a special operation. Lucky them, of course, it's a war. They've started it, they wanted it, and why is that? Now, I bet you've already noticed something, that I've never mentioned a leader so far. I did not say Vladimir Putin has started the war. I did not say Vladimir Putin wanted the war and so forth. Of course, Vladimir Putin started the war. He wanted it, he still wants it, is the main responsible. We all can agree about this. But it's not that important. Because if we were to think that one individual, as bad as he can be, as in the case of Putin, we think that one individual can change the course of history. That is because we watch too much Netflix. Or maybe we've read too many history books. History is the most important subject there is. But usually we tend to read and study of kings and queens and fighters, I don't know, basically they're all male, by the way. And we get the impression that history was determined, has been determined by a handful of individuals. But we have no news of the billions of people that passed on to this earth, that seemingly they were forsaken by history. That cannot be. That's not just part of not knowing history. It's also something that propaganda by countries and governments tend to pursue. What do I mean? If I'm a government against Russia, and there are many reasons to be against Russia nowadays, and of course the US government is against Russia, and it goes both ways, of course. If I am the US government and I want regime change in Russia, I tend to consider at fault just the leader of Russia. If you hear politicians from around the globe, when they're inside a war or when they take a side in a quarrel or in a crisis, they never tend to say that very people is at fault. It's not Russians who wanted the war, it's just Putin. That's what you're told. But that's not true. That is never true. Because this war comes from afar, and it's very Russian. And it's not Putin that has created Russia. It's the other way around. If Putin were born in Ohio, I don't know if that'd be better. But of course, jokes aside, his view of Ukraine would be very different, of course. Because it's Russia that has created Putin. And what does that have to do with Ukraine? People tend to have a collective psychology. Even we do. We're different individuals, of course. We all have our psychologies. And our psychologies tend to be very different and diverse. But when we take ourselves into account as part of a nation, we found out that we have, beyond our personal psychology, a collective one. Something we do not have control on. If, for example, let's take Italy. The Italian collective psychology has many perks, many flaws, just as every nation does. And if we were to take the flaws of Italians, not a lot of social discipline, maybe none. Not a lot of, let's say that Italy doesn't have the myth of the rule of law. The rule of law is considered something to be worked around. And other flaws here, being indebted is not considered something to be ashamed of. If you go to Japan, if you go to Germany, people in their collective psychology tend to consider national debt a disgrace, something they're ashamed of. Italians do not. But if we take your teacher, I'm sure she's very disciplined. Of course. Socially disciplined as well. But if we take ourselves as Italians, we're not. And that works for every nation. Americans tend to think that the world begins and ends with them. And people around the world make fun of them because of this. But I'm sure that among you, there are people that know that they're just a small part of the world. But if we take Americans as a collective psychology, when they go abroad, they have an attitude as if they were the beginning and the end of the world. That's collective psychology that goes beyond ourselves. What does that have to do with the war in Ukraine? The Russians are a very insecure people. Why is that? Because they live on a huge flat land. Living on a flat land makes people insecure wherever they are in the world. Why? Because a flat expanse cannot be defended, especially if it's huge. Basically, the flat land where Russia stands begins in the heart of Germany, and it goes as far as the Urals, basically the border between Europe and Asia. It's not a border of anything, but geographers, they indicated it as a border. If you live on such a flat land, you cannot hide yourselves behind any mountain. That's what people tend to do even nowadays. And the presence or lack thereof of mountains makes people secure or insecure. Why? Because the Russians have been invaded many times. See, to invade Russia is very easy. To stay there, more complicated. But to invade it, very easy. Italians, in different formations, even before that Italy got to be unified in 1861, Italians invaded Russia 6 times. During the Second World War, Italy has invaded the Soviet Union, 1942, alongside Germany, of course. Then, as I said, to stay there is more complicated, but to invade it is very easy. I talked about the Swedes. Sweden, in the 18th century, has invaded Russia. They lost a war in Ukraine. Napoleon, France, of course, has invaded Russia at the beginning of the 19th century, and they lost the war just before reaching Moscow. And I can go on, of course. So when you live on such a land, you tend to consider just one thing, as if we were in a video game. You need to have more chances, more lives, if you were a character of a video game. Meaning that you want to defend yourselves in a buffer state. Because you can make a mistake at least once and go back. If you defend yourselves in your own territory, you cannot make any mistakes. Because if you do, you're lost. You're already with your back behind the wall. That's the concept of buffer states that I'm sure you've encountered many times and when you study history. But maybe they never explain to you why buffer states are so important. That's the reason why. The Russian people who are imperialistic and basically racist, they tend to consider Ukraine as the most important of buffer states. Of course, as you can all imagine, without caring at all of what Ukrainians think or want. If we were to be even more sincere, the Russians do not consider Ukrainians to exist. For real. They say that Ukrainians do not exist, the Russians. The Russians with an accent. It's not a joke. They say so for real. Yes, they have an accent, but the Russians need to learn Russian more properly. Of course, it's not true. Ukrainians are a people. And of course, they're entitled to decide for themselves. But throughout history, the Russians learned to dominate Ukraine because they needed it to defend themselves. Napoleon was defeated and he got to withdraw from the outskirts of Moscow, going back in Ukraine, and Ukraine was defeated for good. Germans, Italians, they were defeated for good in Ukraine. Swedes, they were defeated for good in Ukraine. That's why Ukraine is so important for Russians. And being Russians humans, even though a popular British songwriter, Sting, needed to write a song to explain to the Brits that Russians are humans. It's called Russians. I don't know if you ever listened to it. He says, we share the same biology, because the Brits weren't sure that the Russians were as human as them. But being Russians humans, they also have, let's say, a sentimental attachment to Ukraine, which is crazy, yes. But it's also true. As they do not consider Ukrainians to be an independent people, when they see that Ukrainians legitimately look towards the West, not because they fell in love with the West, the Western values, no one cares about this stuff, simply because they've been under Russia for too long to want to be somewhere else, to be free. So they call for the West, especially the US, but also for Western Europe, to help them free themselves from Russia. And when Ukrainians do so, the Russians are disappointed for real. They do not pretend. They're very disappointed and they're hurt by this. It's crazy, I know. But nations work this way. Why are they hurt? Because they feel betrayed. It's something like in sentimental relationship between two human beings, and there's someone who's abusive towards the other, but when the other frees himself or herself, the abusive one is hurt. It's crazy, of course, but he's hurt for real, doesn't understand. And Russia, which has been abusive towards Ukraine for centuries, tends to get hurt by watching Ukraine looking towards the West. Now, and then we'll talk about China and the US and how they get into this war. Russia has decided to invade Ukraine because they understood that Ukrainians were looking more and more towards the West. And they thought, the Russians thought, that if they weren't to act, Ukraine would be in the Western camp too soon, and they would lose their best buffer state, and they would lose also a trophy. Because Ukraine, in their imperial mindset, is also a trophy. And Russians are an imperial people. What do they leave off? Not material wealth. They don't have much material wealth. They were mostly poor by Western standards. And they have been poor for centuries. It's not something that they're experiencing now for the first time. What do they leave off? They leave off something that probably will make us laugh. They live off glory. For real. Great powers, even the US, they live off glory. If the Americans, most of you, were to lose the number one spot, so to speak, among the nations of the world, they would get depressed, for sure. All peoples do when they lose something that they cherish. They understand how much they cherish this when they lose this. And Russians also look at Ukraine as a trophy because they leave of glory. In maybe simpler terms that you could possibly use at dinner, what does that mean? That even if they're not rich, even if they do not have political rights, not the way we think of political rights, even if they're not free, they're proud of being Russians because they say, we're strong, we're feared, we fight, and we win. 2023, they live off this, just like the US in some way, or China, or Turkey, or Iran, the major empires of our time. So that's the reason why when Putin wields propaganda, and there's a lot of propaganda in Russia, censorship, you name it. When we think of propaganda, we also have to remember that human beings are not stupid. And sometimes we Westerners think the other way. And it's not correct. I'm sure that you heard that the Russians do not know. Yeah, of course, they follow Putin because they do not know what's beyond their borders. What they watch on TV is fake. Yes, it is fake. It's propaganda. Because there's censorship, but they're not stupid. Because human beings are not stupid anywhere. Maybe the most sophisticated literature of all time is the Russian literature of the 19th century. 80% of Russians in the 19th century, 85 to be precise, percent of the Russian people back then cannot read or write. But they produced the most sophisticated literature of all time. How's that possible? Because being clever or intelligent is not the same as being cultured. They're different routes. The Russians know that they're watching propaganda. They know they're watching censorship. Basically, propaganda works this way. Let's pretend that we're in a dictatorship now. And your colleague here in the front row, now he would stand up and shout something against a dictator that rules this country. Likely, it's a fantasy. What would happen to him? We, and your teacher, we were bound to report him because of this. You get arrested, and tomorrow you will not see him in class. And you all know why. But you won't find anything about this on newspapers, anything on TV, anything on social media. But you know that happened. You know that you're watching censorship. That's the same for the Russians nowadays. They know everything. Why do they accept this? Because, well, first, they've never experienced democracy the way we think of democracy. So they do not miss this. But also, because they live off glory. They look at the regime, they do not like it. most of Russians don't like Putin. But they still keep Putin in power because they think that Putin embodies their anti-Western sentiment. He embodies the glory they're pursuing. Because Putin says, we're fighting against the West. We're fighting for empire. We're fighting for us to be a great power. And for people such as Russians, that's very important. And that's the reason why they invaded Ukraine. How does the US and China get into this? If we were talking about a TV series, we could say that the war in Ukraine is a spin-off of the major competition between the US and China. How so? When we're witnessing a global competition, whatever happens around the globe is connected to it. There's no way that it is not. That it is not. There's no way. During the Cold War, what happened in Vietnam or in Afghanistan or in, I don't know, in Yugoslavia, it was all connected to the major competition between the Soviet Union and the US. Now, China and the US are not on the same level, not as much as the Soviet Union and the US were during the Cold War. But China is trying to defy the US, of course. And of course, you know that Washington, the US, decided to defend Ukraine when the war broke out. Not only, of course, because of, partly so, but not only because of the US is defending civil rights, is defending the freedom of the Ukrainian people. That's part of the story. The US is not an NGO. We cannot forget that. Otherwise, the US would intervene everywhere around the globe. Superpowers tend to be very selective. When they're not selective, it's because they're crazy. And sometimes, being made up of humans, they can be crazy. The US after September 11th was crazy because it was hurt. And the US ended up invading Afghanistan, October 2001. And the Americans stayed in Afghanistan for 20 years for no reason at all. Then in March 2003, the US invaded Iraq. And the US and also Italians stayed in Iraq for 8 years until 2011. During that time, something that President George W. Bush called the war on terror. Maybe you're too young, but I'm sure you already heard of it. The war on terror doesn't make any sense because terrorism is not an actor. It's not a country. It's not a government. Terrorism is a tactics. Basically, waging war on terror is akin to waging war to a basketball scheme, to a basketball tactics or soccer tactics. Terror is something that an actor, criminal organization, a nation, a militia, uses to pursue its own agenda. It's not terror itself. It's not terror that walks around the room. Terror is what an actor wants to produce onto people for them to pressure their government into doing something else. Why do I tell you this? Because when the US was bogged down in Afghanistan and in Iraq, China, of course, took advantage of it very much. When your rival, you could call it enemy, is distracted, you're happy. Between 2001 and 2011, China bought from the US Treasury bonds for billions of dollars. And if you want to count to see how much the US spent in Afghanistan in the first 10 years, is the exact sum that China bought of US debt in that very period of time. Meaning that China paid for the US occupation of Afghanistan to the very last dime. Napoleon, of course, taught something about this. Napoleon used to say, never disturb an enemy that makes a mistake. Possibly pay for a strip. And that's what China did. Now the US learned its lesson. If we were before the Civil War, we would say their lesson, that after the Civil War, the American English grammar changed. If you were to read a book from 1825, you will read the US are. After the Civil War, as you do now, you will read the US is, which grammarly doesn't make any sense, but it was a way to mend what happened during the Civil War. And we go forth. The US learned its lesson. As Winston Churchill would say, the Americans will make a lot of mistakes before doing the right thing, as all humans do, actually. That's the reason why the US is not waging a direct war in Ukraine, because the US thinks, rightly, that China would take great advantage if the US was so distracted. But something is also happening that the US does not like about this war. Of course, Russia got bogged down. Russia wanted to cause regime change in Kyiv. That did not happen. Russia wanted to invade the whole of Ukraine. That did not happen. Russia basically controls the eastern part of the country and a small southern part of Ukraine, also Crimea, but they got Crimea in 2014. But still, and Ukraine, thank God, is still alive in a sovereign, more or less, way. What does the US not like about this? That Russia, because of its own deficiencies and flaws and errors, strategic errors, has gotten into the arms of China. And that's not something that works for the US. That's very simple. Grammar, again, this time strategic grammar. If you have two main enemies, you're supposed not to fight them together. You're supposed to divide the enemy front, the enemy camp. More specifically, you're supposed to take the weakest one and play it against the strongest one. That's something that powers used to do back in the days, I don't know, the Persians or the ancient Greeks. but even before them, the Romans, of course, did that as well. And the Americans did so. Actually, a maneuver, so to speak, the US did during the Cold War was crucial to winning that Cold War. In 1969, something very strange happened. China, communist China, led by Mao Zedong, and the Soviet Union, communist Soviet Union, 1969, they got into a war and they fought themselves. Political scientists, for no apparent reason, were sure that if you share an ideology, you're supposed to be friends. I never understood why, but that's it. But even nowadays, I'm sure you heard of democracies go together, they get along, dictatorships get along, and I never understood why. It's if you have two bullies. I've never saw two bullies getting along, but apparently that's what they teach us. In 1969, two communist countries were into a war for a border, for two rivers on the Soviet-Chinese border. Henry Kissinger, that I'm sure you all know, a German man who moved to the US when he was an adolescent. And back then, he was the National Security Advisor under the Nixon administration presidency. He sought that war and had a vision. He said, see, the enemy front can be divided. Let me go to China. Now, in American English, going to China is a saying, meaning to change things. And it refers to Kissinger going to China in 1971 and then in 1972. Why did he go to China? Back then, the US did not have diplomatic relations with communist China. Back then, only Taiwan was recognized by the US as the legitimate China. So Kissinger's trip was secret, literally secret. The US television, I think it was ABC, I'm not sure. Kissinger was in Pakistan and he was supposed to go back to the US, but he did not land in Washington, D.C. So the news had to say something to the American people. And they said that he wasn't feeling well, that he was feeling sick, and that he had to overstay in Pakistan, not Switzerland. He was in Peking, as it was called back then. During the 70s, American English called Beijing Peking. Then in 1986, the Chinese government wanted the US to change the name, and they did so. If you watch a very fun movie that I really liked when I was a child called Big Trouble in Little China with Kurt Russell, starring Kurt Russell, they say Peking all the time. And it was 1985, I think. Anyways, Kissinger goes to China and he tells them, you don't have to stay with the Soviet Union, you have to come with us. And China did so. When the Soviet Union, not because they fell in love with the US, of course, they hate the US, but they hated Soviet Union even more because they were waging a war against them because they were too close. They touch each other along the border. The US is on the other side of the ocean. And if you were to choose a great power, and if you have the chance to choose, usually you don't have the chance, but if you have the chance, you always choose the furthest power. That works for us as well. What is the member of your family, not your parents or siblings, member of your extended family that you appreciate the most, the one you rarely see, of course. She or he is perfect. That works for powers as well. The less we see each other, the more we appreciate ourselves. That's why the US tends to be chosen by many, many countries, because the US is not on the Eurasian continent. That's the main perk of the US. It borders with fish on two sides. Canada, up north. Nothing to say about Canada. It's the US made perfect. The US without violence and crime and poor people on the streets. And the US with an health sector that works. Then you have Mexico. Mexico will be a great power, but it's still not, and not yet. So the US is very protected and secure. That's the reason why, and far away. That's the reason why many, many countries tend to choose the US. And that's the main reason why communist China did as well. Nowadays, the US should, and I'll wrap this up with this. Nowadays, the US should do the same with Russia, because now the weakest one is Russia. It's not China. China is the strongest enemy. The US should open up to Moscow, but so far hasn't. And why didn't the US do so, or hasn't done so yet? Because Russia is too big. It insists on the European continent, and the US does not know how to manage Russia. If Russia wouldn't be an enemy, how do you treat Russia? Seriously, how do you? When Kissinger went to China, because Kissinger now is 100 years old and still very clever. And he loved to ask people questions, very complicated questions. When he met China's prime minister, he spent hours and hours with him, Zhou Enlai. He fell in love with Zhou Enlai intellectually. Kissinger loves the East. And all of a sudden, he asked him something. Kissinger, being convinced that the Chinese memory is incredibly long, he wanted to have Zhou Enlai stand on a very old event, the French Revolution, 1789. He asked Zhou Enlai, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" The interpreter, being shocked by the question, did not think that the question was for real. I think it was a she, thought that Kissinger was asking about the Paris riots of 1968. Because in Chinese, revolution or revolt is the same, let's say, word. It's not a word, but we understood each other. So she asked Zhou Enlai, "What do you think of the students' uprising in Paris 3 years before?" And Zhou Enlai said, "It's too early to judge." Kissinger was shocked. they were talking about an event that took place 2 centuries before. And a Chinese old man, being as clever as he can, couldn't make an educated guess about this. So he went back home and on the plane back to Washington, D.C., told the story to each and every one. See, the Chinese memory is so long that it'll take 3 or 4 centuries to them to have an opinion on events. Why do I tell you this? Because, and then I'll leave the floor to your questions. When we talk about great powers, the first exercise, the first drill, I would say, if we were in a military school, that we're supposed to do is to get ourselves into the shoes of other nations. We have to change our perspective if we want to understand geopolitics. Humans are bad and good, as a song would say. Yeah, there are better and worse, but they're all humans. And if we take our point of view, our Western point of view, and we pin this point of view onto the others, we will get confused because things do not work. Kissinger, being a genius, made such a mistake. We, being less geniuses, or at least not as much as Kissinger is, were more inclined to make such a mistake, I think. So now the US, and let's keep an eye on this, in the years going forward, they're supposed to open up to Moscow, even if now it sounds incredible and strange and against nature. But superpowers are not on NGOs, as I said. They change their views. And now there is a part of the security and defense apparatus in Washington, D.C., that it is convinced that that's the right path to pursue, to open up to Russia. And they tend to hide themselves behind a man called Donald Trump. Doesn't know anything about what we're saying today. Of course, he's a politician. He's not an expert. Thanks for him. But he would like to be Putin. He would like to be a dictator, and he would like to have great powers. Now, a US president doesn't have great powers at all. The US Constitution is almost perfect because of this. Because it prevents any leader to actually decide. That's genius. Because it was devised at the end of the 18th century. They were fleeing Europe. They were mostly English men, not women, unfortunately, that were deciding and fleeing Europe, and they did not want to reproduce the violence that they saw back in England. So Trump cannot decide by himself. But, and as he tried during, for now, the only term that he had at the White House. Back then, he wanted to open up to Russia just because he wants to make business, wants to be Putin. But the US security apparatus was not on board with them. Now things could be different. So if he were to win, first, and that's, I don't have an idea about this. But if he were to win the presidency, I will keep an eye on this. And if the US were to open up to Russia, the competition between the US and China would change for good. Now, I talk too much, but I leave the floor to your questions.
Thank you, Dario, very much. I'm not going to say anything and just leave the floor. There's a lot to say, but I was going to say, you can.
She's actually leaving the floor for real.
Yeah, she's leaving the floor. I actually have one question that came via email by a student. Can you hear me? Yeah. And I can put that on the floor unless there's any other more burning questions. All right. So this is
We need an icebreaker. We need an icebreaker.
yeah, maybe Anderson, who couldn't come, will be our icebreaker. This is Anderson, and here are my questions. One, there are a lot. We'll go with a couple. Do you personally think that the war between Russia and Ukraine is just Ukraine fighting for its freedom from Russia, or another way for Western countries to spread their power and influence over at Russia's doorstep near? Do you want another one?
No, I will answer very quickly. I think that, of course, each and every great power, or even, medium power, tends to pursue its own interests. But still, in the case of Ukraine, as I tried to explain before, that's a very complex country, because Ukrainians are both Ukrainian speaking, but also Russian speaking, as I bet you do know. But the majority of them would like to look towards the West, because they want to be beyond Russia. So I do not think that it's the Western countries trying to spread their influences, as the students implies. I think that maybe that's also a part of it. But before that, there's the Ukrainian people desire to be somewhere else. Let's put it this way.
Did that work as an icebreaker? No.
Not yet.
I can keep on going. Got 4. At any point in the coming years, do you see Italy having a deep relationship with both the US and China at the same time, simultaneously? Can you see Italy acting as the bridge, making the US and China closer to each other? And I'm going to tie the other one as well. Why do you think there are political biases preventing Italy or other Western countries from having a closer relationship with China?
Political biases. To the first question, no, I do not think that Italy could work as a bridge between the US and China. Italy is not that important to be a bridge between such two great powers. Italy, maybe some of you do not know, in 2019, Italy signed the memorandum for the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is basically the Chinese globalization, to be very simple, to make it very simple. Now, Italy signaled that does not want to renew that memorandum. So we will abandon the One Belt, One Road initiative, just because we're part of the American camp, and there are things that we cannot decide by ourselves, to be very realistic. Italy, being a country focused on economics mostly, thought that it'd be possible to play onto several tables, but it's not that easy, especially if you're not that important. And Italy is not that important nowadays, so it cannot be a bridge, and it cannot play and dance with too many actors, especially when it comes to the main enemy of the US.
I have one last question from Anderson. Do you think countries within the EU should continue relying on the US, or start to have their own political stand on who to support in the US-China relationship? Have we grown up enough?
Maybe we're grown up, but as I said before, there are two main reasons why Western European countries, but also Eastern European countries, they still tend to choose the US. One reason we have already looked at it before, because the US is very far away. and also as a Western country, unlike China. We're talking about Western powers. And the other reason is that China is an export-driven country. The U.S. is an import-driven country, and that's very important. If you are at the center of an international system, as the U.S. is, you're supposed to import goods from other countries. You're supposed to have to run a trade deficit. And the U.S. has a huge trade deficit, not by mistake. The Romans did so. The British did so back in the 19th century. If you're a global superpower at the center of the globalization, as the U.S. is, you're supposed to buy other powers' goods, not to sell them your goods, because that's the only way to have your currency global, to make your currency global. Because if I buy your goods, I pay with my money, and I materially put my money into your hands. From now on, you're forced to take into account my wealth, because my wealth first is denominated in my currency, and you have my currency in your bank account. China is an export-driven country. So other countries that are export-driven, such as all Western countries, Italy, Germany, France, the UK, Spain, et cetera, they cannot choose a country that exports more than they do, because it's not profitable, not in the long run.
The questions from Anderson are done, and I know there's been a lot of inputs in the last hours of many interesting different ideas, but there's never a wrong question. So if there's any curiosity, not really. Anna,
There's also another
sorry,
question.
I know I saw you. Fabio's running with a microphone.
Yeah, can you speak to claims of Chinese or Russian influence in US political elections? Maybe to what extent, what that means moving forward, especially in light of an election year next year?
I'm sorry, I did not hear.
If I understood, Russian and Chinese influence in US political elections
okay.
coming up. Right.
Well, thank you for your question. We all know, especially looking at past elections, not only in the US, but around the Western world, so to speak, we know that there are trolls, bots, and propaganda being spread on the internet, and not only on the internet. But that's something that gets back to what I was telling you before about propaganda. Fake news exists, of course. There are a lot of fake news on the web, not only on the web, actually. But fake news is not something new at all. Fake news has been around since the beginning of our lives on the earth as human beings. When we look at fake news and propaganda being spread by foreign agents during the electoral campaigns around the globe, we always have to think that when people want to believe something, there's always a reason. We cannot just say, of course, that's fake news. That's not good. But why do people want to believe that? Which is much more important, because as I said, people are not stupid at all. Sometimes they want to believe something which is clearly fake, because it responds to a fear they have, caters caters to, I don't know, grievances that they have and so forth. That's to say that I do not believe that propaganda can decide elections, because people tend to think with their own heads. And when they believe fake news, there's always a reason why they do so. When they wanted to believe, for example, fake news around Trump, and we know that during the electoral campaign back in 2016, there was a lot of fake news. That's because, and we learned that in the years in the following years, we learned that there is a part of the U.S., part of the U.S. population that does not like the U.S. government, that looks at the U.S. government with fear or suspect, and they believe in people behind masks running the show and so forth. That tells us that inside the U.S., as in many other countries, from huge part of the public opinion, there's very little trust into the institutions. That's the reason why fake news tend to thrive. And I would focus and concentrate on this, unlike concentrating on trolls and Russia and China. Yeah, they're real. They try to influence. But if they can influence the elections, it's because there's resentment, there's grievances that can be worked on. There's a hype that can be built up.
So I had a question. So in the conflict between the US, China, and Russia, do you think that the only solution for the US is to go to Russia, or could they possibly join with India or another superpower?
Thank you. That's a very good question. We did not talk about India at all. You're right. India is a great power, as you said. It won't be a superpower. And India is anti-China, is very much anti-China. They're also near. They're the two most populous countries in the world. Back in 2020, meaning 3 years ago, they waged a small war on the Himalaya border. Maybe you didn't notice, but the 24 soldiers hailing from India and China got killed. And that's the reason why India is part of something called the Quad, comprising India, the US, Australia, and Japan. That's a sort of military alliance devised to contain China from the sea. But the problem with India, actually there are two main problems. The first one, yes, India is anti-China, but it's also anti-US. It's anti the West. And we can all understand why. India was a British colony for too long. And it gets complicated for them to distinguish between Western people from the UK or from the US or from France or Germany, or whites, and we left very bad memories, even if we tend to overlook those memories. The other problem with India is that India is not a nation. It's not an empire, and it's not a nation. India is made up of several nations, many nations. That's the reason why back in the 19th century, the UK, which was and is a small country, could dominate India for longer than a century. Because there are so many nations inside of India that you can play them against the other, one against the other, and then the other against the other one. So that's why India will never be a superpower. Because to be a superpower, first you have to be secure of your home front, your domestic front. To go to the world, you have to be sure that back home nothing happens. The US decided to get into the First World War, April 1917. Why? Because the British Embassy intercepted back then a cable coming from Germany and directed to Mexico City. And in that cable, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany promised Mexico that if they were to get into the war against the US, in case of victory, they would get back all the states that they had lost in 1848 during the war against the US, half of Mexico's territory now being part of the US. California, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Nevada. That's the reason why the US decided to go to war, because they felt their home front being, let's say, being in trouble because of this. And India doesn't have the luxury. They always have their own front in trouble. That's why, yes, the US tends to coordinate, even to ally with India. But India will always have those great problems inside of it. And Russia, maybe going forward, and I'll stop here. Russia going forward is first declining, aging, being very poor, but Russia is more solid when it comes to home front, when it comes to waging wars and so forth, more solid than India. Now,
Thank,
Thank you so much. I know that your time is almost over, if I'm not wrong.
yes,
I
but
really appreciate and
thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Camila, for the introduction. Thank you guys for
thank you, everyone.
attending the